Hey guys, it's Jay, and I recently went and saw Independence Day Resurgence, and I gotta tell you, I think it's one of the best sequels I've ever seen. And I'm definitely gonna defend that statement later on, because when you get on IMDb and Rotten Tomatoes and everywhere else that does ratings, it's getting torched by fans and critics alike. It's got horrible ratings. But first, I want to talk about just sequels in general, different types of sequels, and what makes a good sequel, and what kills a sequel, and things like that. And the first type of sequel I want to talk about is what I'm going to call the continuous shot sequel. And what I mean by that is the crew and the cast and everybody goes out and they film all of the movies of a series. Either it's 2 movies or 3 or however many it is. They film all of the movies at one time before the first one is even released. And then they release it one every year or 2 or whatever until they're all released. And this one does not happen very often, but I wish it would happen a lot more because it is the absolute best way to do a sequel. The problem is it's also the most dangerous way to do a sequel because there's no guarantee that that first film is going to be successful. And if it's not, then all of this hard work making 2 or 3 different movies is down the drain because it's not a successful franchise. And the best examples of this are the Lord of the Rings trilogies, where they went out and they made all 3 Lord of the Rings movies and then they started releasing them. And the beauty of doing a movie like this is that you don't have hindsight when you make the other 2. The thing that hamstrings sequels more than anything else is when they release a movie and then they see the response to that movie and then they go back to the drawing board and they say, well, the fans really liked this, they really didn't like that. And then they kill whatever it is the fans don't like and they increase whatever it is the fans do like, and what ends up happening is it overdoes it. And you find out that what the fans liked, they really just liked in moderation. But with this one, you don't get that. So you just have the same, I'm going to call it spirit of the movie all the way through the series. The only other example of this I could think of was Kill Bill Volumes 1 and 2. And what happened here was Quentin Tarantino made one movie. He made Kill Bill. And when they got done with it, he realized it was like 5 hours long, which is way too long for a release. But as he was trying to edit it down, he realized that there was nothing he really wanted to cut out. So rather than cutting anything out, they just split it into 2 movies. And really, Lord of the Rings and Kill Bill are the only 2 I can think of that did this, so I don't have an example of a bad movie like this. But I really wish that they would start doing this more often. It's a way to make sure that if the first movie's good, all of them will be good, because you're not going to ruin it with hindsight. And the next one I want to talk about is the surprise sequel. And surprise sequel means that the movie was made to be a standalone movie, but it did so well and was so popular that they decided to give it a sequel. And the one I've chosen as my good in this is National Treasure Book of Secrets. And I know that's a little odd because National Treasure Book of Secrets seems like a pretty forgettable film and nobody really talks about it much. But it did a really good job of building off of what they established in the first National Treasure movie. They didn't just kill it. It remained constant. If you watch the first one and the second one back to back, they feel like they're in the same vein of imagination. Or I don't know exactly how to say it, but what I'm trying to say is they didn't overdo anything. They just kind of stayed true to the formula that got them there in the first place. And it's a movie that I think gets a lot of hate because it's really hard to make a sequel, especially to a movie that did not expect a sequel and live up to the expectations that are expected of it. And I think Book of Secrets did that really well. And when you compare it or you contrast it with what I'm going to call the bad side of this, which is the Pirates of the Caribbean sequels, were absolutely terrible. And when I talk about the spirit of a movie or the atmosphere of a movie, this is what I'm talking about. You see, the first Pirates of the Caribbean was a fantastic movie. I loved the movie, as did so many other people. And if you ask people what they loved about the movie, they'll probably say something like they really loved the special effects of the cursed crew of the Black Pearl when they would go in and out of moonlight and seamlessly switch between skeletal and human. I mean, this sword fight at the end of the movie is one of the best sword fights I've ever seen, in large part due to the attention to detail in these moonbeams shining down, turning this guy into his skeletal form throughout the fight. It's really, really cool. And the other thing they'll tell you that they loved about it is Jack Sparrow being Jack Sparrow. He was a really entertaining character, and he was everything that that movie needed him to be. But the true reason that that movie specifically was so great is moderation. Because you may think that Jack Sparrow is the star of the movie, but even though the plot revolves around him pretty heavily, he is still a side character. Legolas and his love story is the main plot of the movie, and he gets the majority of the screen time, and Jack Sparrow is kind of just the oddball comic relief guy who kind of shows up at just the right moment to make you laugh and ask why the rum's gone and kind of, wave his hands around crazily and be silly. But it's the moderation, it's the anticipation of when you're going to get to see Jack Sparrow do something else funny that is really what drives the movie. And then you flash forward to the next movie where the cursed pirate crew is in their silly-looking fish monster form every time you see them. There's no moderation there. You never see them as human. They're always monstrous. And 90% of the screen time goes to Jack Sparrow, and 100% of his screen time goes to him doing ridiculous things. And they go from having one of the best sword fights I've ever seen to having probably the worst sword fight I've ever seen put to screen. And that is exactly what happens when you aren't planning a sequel, and then you say, well, the fans really liked this, so let's just give them a movie that is 90% this. And the next one is the big budget sequel. And I'm not talking about a big budget sequel to a big budget movie. I'm talking about when you make a movie with a relatively low budget, but it does so well that you then turn around and you make a sequel, quote unquote. Sometimes you just make a remake of that low budget movie the way you really wanted to. And this can be great or it can be terrible. The best example of this, though, is Desperado. You see, Robert Rodriguez, when he broke into film, what he did was he went and did a drug trial. And it paid somewhere in the $4,000 range, if I remember correctly. And he took that $4,000 and he made a movie called El Mariachi. And it is the lowest of the low budgets. And it's not very big in America. I don't suggest you watch it. It's not real great. It's, like I said, it's extremely low budget. But it hit huge in Mexico. And Robert Rodriguez ended up making a ton of money on it. And what he did with that money was he then turned around and he remade it, or he made a sequel, unofficial remake to it. It was the exact same plot in Desperado. And Desperado is one of the coolest action movies ever made. Like, if somebody comes up to you and says, "What is the definition of a chick flick?" all you have to say is Pretty Woman. And if somebody comes up to you and says, "What's the definition of a guy movie?" all you have to say is Desperado. It is the quintessential guy movie, and it is, like I said, one of the coolest action movies ever made. A lot of people don't even know it's a sequel. It is, in fact, a sequel to El Mariachi, but it was made basically because he finally had the budget to do what he wanted to do. But it doesn't always turn out that way. All right, and the perfect example of a failure in this regard is The Matrix. Now, a lot of people don't realize that The Matrix was a low-budget movie. It was made on a budget of something like $100 million less than the average movie in 1999. It was still fairly big budget. I think it cost $40 million to make, so a lot more than $4,000. But compared to the movies coming out at the time, it was low budget. And what they did to get around that budget was awesome. It is the perfect mixture, this like marriage of CGI and practical effects, where you actually have real actors on wires, and you're doing neat little gimmicky tricks with multiple cameras and things like that to get these awesome 360 swirl shots and everything else, and it all just looked amazing. And then they ended up making a ton of money on it, obviously, because it's one of the biggest action movies of all time. And then comes the sequel, and the sequel was just awful, just absolutely awful, because they finally had enough money to do what they wanted to do with it. But the problem is that with all this extra money and it just a truckload of CGI added into it, it lost all of the intrigue. It lost all of just the quirkiness of the original movie. I mean, the best way to sum this up is they went from this to this. Like that is one of the biggest downgrades in movie history, and that's what happens when you get a little bit too far up your own brown eye with a budget. And the last one I want to talk about is the Time Gap sequel. And this is the one where there's like 10, 15, 20, 30 years between the last movie and the sequel that just came out. Obviously, I'm going to talk about Independence Day with this one, but I want to talk about bad first. I thought that Star Wars The Force Awakens was one of the worst sequels I'd ever seen. And the reason that I say that is because in their desperation to recapture the spirit of the original movies, they ended up just remaking the original movies. Like, Star Wars The Force Awakens is exactly what A New Hope was, except Han Solo is playing Obi-Wan and Drifter is playing Darth Vader, and ultimately it just fell flat. Now, don't get me wrong, The Force Awakens was a really good movie because Star Wars was a really good movie. So obviously a movie that is almost word for word Star Wars is going to be really good. But it ended up being, again, one of the worst sequels in my opinion, because it just remade what the original was. If I knew that was what it was going to be, I would have just watched Star Wars because I owned that and didn't have to pay $10 to go see in the theater. And that brings me to Independence Day Resurgence, and I love this movie. Again, I absolutely love this movie. There's not going to be any spoilers, by the way, at least nothing massive that I know of. But the thing about Independence Day is it was exactly what the original one was. Like, it had everything you loved about the original movie. It had spaceship dogfights. It had a rogue pilot who flies by his own set of rules. It had Jeff Goldblum doing his best Jeff Goldblum impression. It had an inspirational speech from the president. It had massive apocalyptic consequences, and it had excellently shot destruction of major world cities. It was everything you wanted it to be. It was everything the original was, but what it was not was a remake of the original. It actually was its own brand new story with its own brand new characters and its own arc. And to be able to do both of those things is incredible. And while I do think that The Force Awakens was a better overall movie than Resurgence, I think that Resurgence is by far a better sequel because it was actually a sequel. So thanks for listening and watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future content, and goodbye.